Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Streaming Media Connect 2024. I'm your host, and I'm the hostess with the mostest. I guess that's kind of cliche. I'll have to come up with a different one for the next intro. Thanks for coming back. We've got a great panel here, a little paperwork to begin with. First of all, the first person to have answered correctly with the name of the song and the band and/or performer that was just playing during our walk-on and is here at the end of the panel. So you have to get them both right and stick around to the end of this panel. You'll get a $50 gift card from Amazon, courtesy of Streaming Media Connect. I want to thank everybody for coming. If you have things to add, so look in the chat for things like links to bios of our panelists, also other information. You can post stuff there that's informational. But if you have questions for our moderator or our panelists, please put them in the Q&A. If you don't put them in the Q&A, we can't give you our A. So thank you very much. One last thing, sessions from all 3 days of Streaming Media Connect will be on our YouTube channel next week. Steve will put the link in the chat. And one last thing, I was lying. We do these every quarter, Streaming Media. This is our 14th, although it doesn't look a day over 12. Our next one will be February 25th through 27th, 2025. So please mark your calendars and come back then. So without further ado, I want to thank our sponsor for this panel, Cloudsplitting, not Cloudspitting, Tackling Common Cloud Live Broadcast Workflow Challenges. I want to thank our sponsor, Alibaba Cloud, for bringing us this panel. And then I would like to bring to this stage our wonderful moderator, Nadine Krefetz, who's a consultant with Reality Software. Nadine, take it away.
Thank you so much. I will be hostess number 2. So let's have everyone join us. So John, Lok, Nishant, and Corey, and Daniel. Perfect. I think everyone's here now. So I think one of the most interesting things about this is that as we've been doing some related cloud panels over the years, I think what has been the most compelling thing for people is how things have changed. So I think that would be the first thing I wanted to get people to talk about is how has the live broadcast environment changed now with the cloud? Thinking about like the most recent year or so, because realistically, things keep changing. But Corey, why don't we start with you? You know, when you're thinking about kind of what has been new or what has been happening that you think is very interesting, like just one example so that everyone else has the chance also to talk.
Sure. So I think, first off, people don't know me that are in the audience. My name is Corey Smith. I am in between opportunities, but I spent the last 2.5 years revolutionizing CBS Sports Cloud Production Network. So it brings me here to this panel. Thank you for having me. I think over the course of COVID, we were all forced to cloud. We were all forced to do different things with our workflows that we weren't really comfortable with. Now that we've got an opportunity to kind of regroup, kind of take a deep breath, like figure out what the technology explosion was during COVID for getting us to remote broadcast, REMI, hybrid, all these other kind of definitions and terms, I think it's important for us to take a step back and say, hey, what are people actually doing with cloud, right? I don't think it's ever going to be a truck replacement to a degree that we're doing Super Bowl in cloud. It could be maybe 10, 15 years from now. But I think that until we switch the mindset of some of the legacy broadcast engineering and kind of mindset, cloud is still going to be this opportunity for experimentation. It's going to be an opportunity for us moving workloads to cloud as an extension of our physical facilities and venues. There are some broadcasters out there that are doing things 100% in cloud today. There are some that are doing it kind of a hybrid, a 50-50 split. It's when you have talent and desks, say, on site at a venue, you have commentators at a venue, you can't really replace that in a cloud-based model. So that the two have a symbiotic relationship. The one is assisting the other, right? I don't think it's ever going to be, one or the other. But I think that cloud right now is providing a proving ground for a lot of cool things to come, which is can we really do full REMI 44 camera type of operations in cloud? How do we get there? Is the compute ready? Can we really do that kind of offload? And I think that there's a lot of excitement, at least for me, because I spent the last 7 years in doing, cloud-based kind of lifts. So my take is, cloud's important, and it'll continue to be an important part of the evolution of broadcast.
Okay, so we're going with experimentation from Corey. So Nishant is with Alibaba, who is the speaker for today's panel. So for you, I know you're very active, obviously, in the Paris Olympics, et cetera, but what's the kind of the key thing that you think is newer to people or that you hear people ask you about?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, just a quick introduction. I'm Nishant Agrawal. I'm an industry solutions architect, and I've had the pleasure to really help our customers build different aspects of technologies all the way from live streaming. And I think for the Paris Olympics, one of the really cool things that we have all seen, I'm sure many amongst our audiences and in our panel, we have watched the games over the summer from Paris 2024. And this is an event that basically reaches all over the globe, over a 4 billion audience, and over 2/3 of the actual feeds were broadcast over using cloud technology. So I think we see that not just from broadcasting, but also adding new capabilities around artificial intelligence, and then being able to really create some new pilot projects. One of which is really being able to use UHD, for example, over IP.
Okay, great. Okay, so as I'm creating a list here, we're gonna go with replacement and to UHD. So as you know, I have to try to summarize things in the shortest way possible so that I can actually eventually maintain not only keeping this straight, but then writing about it, of course. But how about you? What, you and I have had this conversation several times, but what's the new thing that you're thinking about this year as to how you are either using the cloud or what you're talking about to other people?
I think it's a melding of some of the traditional streaming stuff and some of the broadcast technology that's also happening. So broadcast technology tend to be like very different from streaming. It was all very specialized hardware. It was like delivery of signals over fiber or satellite or something like that. And today we're seeing more and more of delivery using SRT and other stuff that would be more at home in a traditional internet world of streaming. It could also be that you're using the same encoders, you're doing the same sort of handling of streams in the same way, and those things are sort of getting closer together and learning from each other. So I think a lot of the flexibility and commodity stuff that's in streaming is what's moving into broadcast. And of course, broadcast has a different sort of aspect on reliability of systems. That of course becomes a little bit of a challenge with some of the streaming, but there's a good sort of merging of different systems there that are making things a lot easier in the broadcast world, because moving from traditional SDI infrastructure to IP-based infrastructure, that just adds a lot of flexibility for routing signals internally. That's a good example of that.
Okay, now this is actually, it's almost a trick question because I know that each one of these guys wants to say everything that the other person is saying, because it's obviously all important. But Daniel, why don't you give us a little bit of insight as to what the new thing is? And I know you've got you've got a great detailed kind of environment, I should say, or approach that you guys have created, but what's the one thing that you want to start with?
Sure. So I'm not just a network as a service provider that partners with the likes of AWS and Alibaba here. Previously, I was a customer that used AI to route live broadcasting over IP, and that's a fairly disruptive market. It was mentioned that SRT is common protocol is being utilized now, and yeah, it is been standardized. I was working with a team where we had created our own proprietary protocol and then built AI command and control on it. And all that is well and good, but unless the underlying network infrastructure is well designed or well thought out, not just in its ability to have optimized routes, optimized path, but also the ability for it to be cost modeled around on-demand services where you understand the ingress and egress costs and you try to keep them as static and reliable as possible while supporting 4K and 8K standards. Nishant mentioned that LED Cloud was sponsoring the Olympics for this year, and then the previous year, if you guys remember, 8K was standard for Tokyo Olympics, right? And then that carried on forward. That was the demand and the requirement from the lenses and encoding out to the distribution and to the CNN and suppliers of the content rights holders. You really do have to have, from a technical perspective, a well thought out plan. And when it comes to network and infrastructure, the inherent reliability of an AI command and control with a well-designed protocol, something that can predictively understand the capacity, the quality service capacity across multiple networks, has become the not just the edge but the standard. Olympics was this last June. Olympics was the last contract job I did with distribution rights before joining Console Connect and onboarding as part of a technical partner management for network services. And I can say that I hit the ground running, had to turn about face and start supporting more and more broadcasters and their content push into the cloud, and not just any cloud, just multi-cloud infrastructure. Nowadays, they're trying to leverage every single cloud in the network and its underlying network connectivity and on demand, and minimize their administrative overhead in order to supply a cost that is competitive, a 4K 8K signal from lens to BYOD, bring your own device, and to do it on an on-demand basis, especially with live services. So I've seen that go from a vanguard system 3 years ago to becoming a standard contract from everything from tier 1 to tier 3 supplies for services. Yeah.
And I can't wait. We're gonna in a little while, we will just absolutely jump into the AI control, because I think that's a very fascinating part of this. John, you brought up a couple of different points in our planning. What do you think is one of the newer things that people come and talk to you about, or that you're thinking about?
I'll give you two trends real quickly. One is a lot of the ancillary things that are required for cloud, like 2110, and a lot of those types of things are moving quickly into our customers. So those are it's a lot of integration and a lot of work with partners, and it's coalescing together into, you can put 14 partners in a room and have a 50-50 shot. At the end of the day, you'll have something that'll work, which a year ago, not so much. The other thing I'll toss out is there are technical challenges, but really a lot of what we're hearing is monetization and adding value to video, whatever that looks like. That could look like AI, that could look like data, it could look like a lot of things. But those are really the two things that hit top of mind for me.
Okay, all right. Now we've covered a lot of the stuff. In fact, probably almost everything that we actually, I know there's one or two things we haven't covered yet, which we'll get to. But if we jump into kind of the melding of broadcast and tech, and what does that mean for people? So if you have somebody who is newer and they actually are just starting to meld this, I'm not sure that there is the case that way, but what's the thing that they're thinking about? Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. Delivering. In fact, Daniel, when you started to talk about, you guys have created your own protocol, right? With the system architected. Why don't you touch a little bit on why that protocol is important?
Okay. So, quite frankly, we all know from the market as it has stood for the last 5 years, the existing protocols were pretty basic. As I was working for Katon and we were creating our own protocol starting about 12 years ago and continuing to evolve it with its machine learning and the algorithms that we put in place to give it adaptive capability over challenged networks. There was a need to also be able to fight in the space of SRT and ZXI and the existing protocols that were there. We're part of the SRT forum. We're part of the RIST Alliance, and we saw what they were all lacking, and that was a unique awareness of the layer 3 level, right? It takes a bit of a network brain to produce a network protocol for broadcast. You can't almost have to have your head in both worlds in order to do that. And to evolve from machine learning into AI is a natural progression to kind of optimize a broadcast service. When you're able to predictively understand the quality of service in a mesh network, as it's going into congestion or as it's showing latency and be able to move before the path becomes a challenge instead of when you start seeing your own packet loss, that gives you a very strong capability to provide an SLA. And if you go to the standard protocols that are being used or service integrators that are using the standard protocols today, none of them will give you an SLA, right? So having all of this kind of bespoke, built from the ground up, focused around the network, the instability, the inherent instability of public networks, but also just understanding it, knowing how tier 1 providers and tier 3 providers work together. What is their BGP peering policies, right? How are they integrated, and how quickly can they pick up your signal and run it on the private infrastructure to get it out to the other side? And how many hops do you have to suffer through and cause challenges before it gets the other way? So you build that underlay, and then you put an intelligent protocol on top of it that has AI command and control, and you have a very, very reliable service that you get approached with both tier 1 opportunities, but because it's able to leverage public and private, you can still work within the field of, like, say, tier 3 event-based services as well. And that is an evolution where I see, say, the other protocols and the people that use them and integrate them will need to catch up, right? They're going to have to not just adapt to multi-cloud network infrastructure as a service. They're going to have to put the right tools in place to do it intelligently so that they can adapt in real time.
Okay. Now, so Lok, you are choosing to buy a service. Daniel has developed a lot of these services, if that's a fair way to say this. So Lok, when you're thinking about buying the service, what kind of questions would you have for Daniel about what he was just talking about in terms of how he's actually architected their system?
Well, since we're talking at least some proprietary technology to some extent, I would definitely have some questions about how to be able to observe it, because if I have a vendor, it's a good step to be able to see what's going on there, and if it's not if it's not SRT but something custom made, that might be better. I would want to be able to figure out how, being able to get some metrics out of that system. The other parts, of course, would be, I think, the integration parts. How do I get stuff into it and out of it would be a good indication. Like, do I need, in case of distribution stuff, do I need specialized encoders just for this, or is it integrated into other encoders would be a question I would ask. And then lastly, sort of, what integration do we need to have versus for APIs and stuff like that? I think one of the issues in traditional broadcast is you tend to build stuff where you exchange a whole project of everything at once. my mindset is buying more like individual components, and it sounds like this would be a good case for that. But that means that I would care more about the integration points of the technology I'm buying, so I know that if it works, like it works for me now, but will it work if I exchange some other system down the line, that it will still be integrated and working well? I think those are the kind of questions that would be interesting for me to know. Just because the more closed it is, the more I want to get metrics out. Not that I don't trust vendors, but I would like to be able to see how it's performing and be able to monitor that as well, and just react to issues myself. Great if a vendor can react to them as well, but I would also like to know if there's something going on with the stuff I'm sending.
Okay, all right, good points. Now,
These are perfect, because this is the bread and butter. So what we tell a lot of content creators and then content distributors is also, they may have already leveraged assets in place that already have standardized protocols, right? So a lot of times what we're doing is sitting there saying, okay, you've got this, you got SRT, double up the bandwidth, here's your SLA, and here's a view of our services picking up your SRT signal, converting it to our signal, running it across in real time. You can actually watch it with our services. You could actually watch it switching in real time between it's about 50 millisecond switching or less between the different paths in a mesh infrastructure, and then kicking at the other end. So when it came to encoder decode devices, or that they may have already had, we would put our systems either like they're basically network equipment and or their encode and decode equipment. Depends on the requirement from the customer, and that is key, because you have to be flexible. Do they have equipment in place, or do you bring equipment to them? For example, we were doing Asia Football Group, and Asia Football Group has very non-standard locations. Could be the Seychelles, could be Uzbekistan, right? And it's very hard to approach them and then get into the cloud and then get it down to Eurovision in Geneva, or to Singapore, where AFC has a distribution point, or fire it off to TBS in Australia, and then have it all hit these production points, and possibly even bring it back out and hit content right owners for delivery. So speaking to Loke's requirement for visibly seeing the service in real time, that has to be produced and part of the total overall cost. And again, if you're not doubling their bandwidth and lowering their cost by 20% and giving them an SLA, you're going to struggle to kind of usurp the existing service design that they have. Most broadcasters sacrifice a bit on quality in order to maintain the service integrity. So we would have to walk in with all of these boxes ticked for Loke and for customers like that in order to do the distribution of production. And again, the cost is the challenge, because there's a lot of transparency. You can go to any cloud service provider today and see the costs off the shelf, right? So when you do produce something like that, you are transparent about that. And whatever you put overlay on top of that, you make it a manageable cost. You try to divert from, say, consumption-based costs that match up the cloud, and instead put static licensing, so that you're disruptive in the market, and you can survive. You can still feed the family, so to speak. But you also make sure that the contributor or the distributor is also not left holding the bag on phones. It's not easy, that's for sure. I can tell you that as you can hear from how I talk, this has been a 5 to 7 year journey to get the confidence of tier 1 suppliers at a volume that was sufficient to get the branding out there. But yes, it is a key part of it. And I would leverage pretty much all of the cloud providers here all the time, depending on where it's going. And I would make that transparent to the customer.
Now, I promise that we're going to get to the two cloud providers in a second, but since we are actually kind of putting Daniel on the hot spot. I thought I'd let Corey see if there's any other questions that he would ask Daniel.
Sure.
Mm.
So there's always a question of like build versus buy, right? It's been, from the dawn of time, it's like, do we reinvent the wheel? Do we build our own encoders? Do we build our own CDN? A lot of companies do reinvent this technology for themselves. And over time, I mean, a lot of the acceleration work that you're speaking to has been invented and reinvented over time, whether it's a CDN that's done it, whether it's Deliver, whether it's some other kind of service that does cost route optimization, right? So what would be your take on how good is your mousetrap compared to the people that preceded you?
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a step in for that. What I did that was different is a lot of the bigger brands saddle up to bigger brands. So, and I don't want to throw stones, but I think that in the top of everybody's head flashes across 3 or 4, say, hardware, software providers that have saddled up to one of the top 3 to 4 cloud providers and are not necessarily agnostic. Well, what I did was I made sure that there was an agnostic component to it. In the infrastructure that we provided was everything from our own co-location hotspots that were strategically placed where media is congregated, places like 60 Hudson, LAIX with CoreSite in LA, London LDH with the Cornex, AM5. I would basically look at the places where there's convergence with media providers and either put hard infrastructure in place or spin up bare metal services with a myriad of different cloud service providers. And at one point in time, I was using 22 different cloud service providers and tail hooking in network as a service platforms such as the Console Connect, who I've now joined. And that diversity meant agility. It meant more administrative overhead on my part, but it meant that I could also adapt to challenges. So, for example, with the Olympics in Paris, you don't put everything in Paris. You put stuff in Marseille. You put stuff in different locations where there's cloud infrastructure in place, and you can avoid the underlying infrastructure being congested, and yet still deliver with service level agreement and with the cost. So yeah, what I did different was I put more diversity. I had considerable background, i.e. 27 plus years in telecommunications already, and knew all the relationships that were at play underneath. So it wasn't just having a good protocol with an intelligent kind of command and control. It was knowing that the underlying infrastructure that I put in place had true diversity. If the customer said, hey, we're an AWS house, I would say, well, I can do that, but I'd also recommend going over a Zen layer or Vultr over here, or pumping into Console Connect and Alley Cloud in this location, like, for example, Kuala Lumpur, when I did a concert over there. Or if you guys remember when, oh my God, I can't believe I'm blanking. What's the lady's name she's young, she sings, she did Singapore, it was an exclusive contract.
Taylor Swift?
Taylor Swift. Okay, you can all shoot me now.
Okay, it's amazing that I actually know that, so realistically.
So you can imagine the distribution requirements for something like that and the magnitude. And like you said, Corey, what is different? For us, it was being transparent about the underlying infrastructure, having a true diversity there, and then exposing our protocols, kind of NMS visibility for the customer so they can see it running end to end live.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question to me because there's a lot of like last mile deliveries. You can go with a ton of different CDN providers all over the world. When you start peeling back the layers and kind of getting into the core technology, now you start like seeing broadcasters really trying to figure out like a cloud diversity model. And let's go like the theme of cloud splitting. There's a lot of vendors that are out there that are great in one cloud. they're great over in this cloud, in that cloud, and this
Correct.
other cloud. But when you try to tie all three of those clouds together, or even two of them together, that's when things start to fall down, because the diversity of that particular vendor is not multi-cloud aware. They're not cloud diverse in their actually application environment. So now you start breaking things more down into more silos. And so fundamentally, when you get to do a tier one show, it all kind of falls back to that truck, right? There is no diversity on the truck most of the time, right? There may be, a backup truck, the guy running, a shadow switcher, that kind of thing. But for the most part, you have a single source going at diverse paths, maybe to the same cloud, to the same infrastructure that's running in that cloud, out to a single or multiple CDN providers, and then out to the customers. So from that standpoint, it's very hard to diversify your cloud infrastructure because the vendor layer is preventing some of that. And if you're building your stuff on top of, say, like media services with AWS, media services doesn't exist anywhere else in the world other than in AWS, right? So what are you going to use in Azure? What are you going to use in GCP? So you have to kind of then build or forklift other vendors into the other clouds that may not be compatible with the same workflow that you're doing. Now, all of a sudden, you're supporting multiple tech stacks. Now, all of a sudden, your development in your software stack is getting to be astronomically more expensive because of the fact that the vendors aren't diversified in their own cloud offerings. So do you staff a team of 100 developers to support your tech stacks in these diverse environments to the end of time? Or do you buy 90% off the shelf and hire the 10% that glues it all together? And I think that's really the buy versus build kind of question for me.
Yeah.
Let me get John and Nishant into this conversation, just because I want to make sure that, we don't sit here and put Daniel on the hot seat for the whole time, but, and I'm sure John and Nishant, you hear different things about, whether or not, so Nishant, in fact, you're nodding your head. So do you want to kind of jump in here and share what some of the comments you hear?
Yeah, no, I think it's really, if I may draw the analogy, I think it's really on the build versus buy. What I think is important is the understanding of the role of open source. And so when we think about like different trends throughout the years, when we look at Kubernetes for workload orchestration and looking at SRT, for example, I think a lot of customers would want to choose working on open source technologies because it gives them more freedom. And also at the end of the day, it's really the talent that really enables any of these outcomes. And so engineers want to work on technologies that are open source. And we see the same trend happening with artificial intelligence now, with open source models and different tooling. So I think what we see really is the trend where when I work with my customers, they want to choose a stack which is either open source or relatively a stack that they can understand and work with, so that they're not tied to a single provider.
Okay. All right. Now, in fact, we can't sit here and pick out one provider versus another, because one vendor versus another, because we won't leave this panel being very friendly to each other. But let me quickly jump into a question that came up from the audience, and I'll direct this to John. So Indira writes, she said, what would you share your thoughts on risk mitigation, regarding systems and data protection, especially when they're thinking about bad actors?
That's a whole nother panel, sorry. But anyways, I'll take a shot there.
Okay, well, I'm trying to incorporate the questions from the audience, but is there a part of this that you think that is relevant to our conversation here?
Yeah, it is. I mean, we've been talking a lot about, ingest and egress methods and networks and protocols and stuff. And within that, you need to have encryption and security and robustness there. You also need to have, robustness and security built into your architecture. And, AWS's position is we encourage you to be robust and secure, and we give you the tools to do it, but you still have to do it, whether you have someone else do it or whatever. Security is something, as far as resources and like that is something that nobody wants to talk about until something bad happens. It's just, you know, it doesn't really hit anybody's bottom line about making money or whatever else. All they see it as a cost. And then the question is, well, how much risk do you want to take? And you know, Amazon's approach or philosophy really is to try and build as much into the tooling that's right there, that's already enabled. You know, everything in the clouds moving around is encrypted. You know, at rest, it's encrypted. In flight, you know, so we've given you that. If you want to put another layer on top of it where you want to keep the keys inside your own infrastructure and use your keys into our infrastructure, that's fine. I'm not sure if that's an answer, but I will say that we're having more and more conversations about digital watermarking, DRM, at what point DRM. Most of these conversations are driven by the SLA, by the license grantor. So if a license grantor you know, grants you the license to do something, they may actually direct you to a specific DRM. They may, you know, direct you to a specific watermarking vendor. You know, as a company, we try and support as many as we can and make it as easy as possible as we can. But you know, that's kind of our position. I'm seeing more and more DRM and more watermarking conversations at lower tier level conversations than I've heard, you know, 3 years ago. So there's definitely been an uptick in sensitivity on that. But that's been my viewpoint.
Okay. All right. Now, there was another interesting thing that John actually brought up, which is in terms of, are people building now? So realistically, you had people lifting and shifting certain technologies. Is it now, John, a more cloud native world? Are people thinking about, when they're starting to build their services, building them first for the cloud, or are you still experiencing a lot of a lift and shift approach?
Well, we kind of have to define builder and buyer. They're not exactly the same. They could be a builder but use a system integrator to build for them and walk away with it. So it's not as clear. But what I'm seeing right now is in the media space, we had a lot of lift and shift. People took sketchy software that ran on very large CPUs and memory systems and jammed them into the cloud with less than desirable results at times. And then they, you know, basically fixed a lot as much as they could. And now they're coming, you know, through our partner network and through the ISVs, are cloud native, meaning they're built on cloud services, you know, storage services, network services, and the like of that. So we definitely have seen the trend with that. Unfortunately, what we're finding is a lot of these first releases of these cloud native services are not feature equivalent with what they've been used to on-prem. And there's a little bit of a burn on that as far as getting them up to speed. But generally, for our partners, you know, we have kind of a path that we take about, you know, let's lift and shift them and do as best we can to make it as best as it can. And then, you know, come back and work backwards from a cloud native solution. The last thought I'll leave you with is most of the new development in the media spaces is now cloud native, not on-prem native, not hardware native. We're seeing a lot be able to run multi-cloud. A lot of our very smart, crafty ISVs actually have built their software that'll run multi-cloud, where you can pick the cloud you can pick, because from a business viewpoint, they didn't want to lose, you know, any business or carrying their current customers forward. But there's definitely been the shift now that a lot of the new technologies are cloud native.
Okay. All right. Now, we're getting so many different questions in the chat window or in the Q&A window. I'm trying to make sure we tie things together here, but okay. Does anybody else want to speak on to what John just talked about? Or because I do have a next, Corey, okay?
Well, I was just going to say that John made a very good point about the lift and shift. I mean, we saw that a lot during the COVID weird world where nothing was really live. And if it was live, it was these weird Zoom call kind of things. And it wasn't really broadcast as we know. People were really kind of wrap their head around it. though that was the experimentation phase I kind of spoke with at the top of the call. But I think that John makes a great point on the new level of services. Family Amp, you have TVU, you have Gravio, you have all these other different production tools that are now running in cloud. And up to you, the best path for you. What out of all these tools that are out there, great. But at the same time, you know, the is in catcher. Vendor that you're using in your facility, you want that same vendor and partner to be in cloud. You can't just to migrate from a truck world, those same tools exist in cloud and you can't build that.
No.
On the podcasting, but really if we change, right, all this let's just take an example. There's over 11 now. All of this content needs to be archived and be searchable in the first. So as John mentioned, really for back in all that is real power of
now options can actually integrate and in fact, I would actually, we are going to be about this publicly. I was so senior said, we find prem, we have figured the budgets for it, etc. So you have had these conversations before and had cap covers. What are some of the things that you have to manage, whether it's a kind of redundancy? What are the topics? You know, obviously everyone here has to run different environments, but you also have to know what's going on.
A big for us, but in terms of the cost model, it is different. Example about like Paris would have that Olympics is a great example of that. have a lot of events at the same time that you wouldn't be able to fit on one channel. So if world you can multiple streams and do all of them at the same time, so people target as many people as on the smaller ones, then you're really doing fine. But if you're building out for that and you're building infrastructure 10 up invested in, like on premise, where most power in the cloud ones on them for maybe spin up ahead of time to do per hour or something like that, you have a lot more flexibility in doing that. And so that's a completely different model, because it's all then OpEx, no CapEx, no investment up ahead of time. But it does give you that ability to go up and down that, at least in the streaming world, is very, very useful. In the broadcast world, of course, if you can distribute it to cable companies and so on, because they wouldn't be able to have dynamic channels, then that's a little bit different scenario. But I doubt anybody today is doing broadcast and they're not sending on some sort of streaming over the top solution.
Okay. You know, I do have other comments about cost, but I also, does anyone else want to say anything about that before I jump into the next question, which is on AI?
I'd like to just add that, you know, the biggest challenge with the cloud is predictability, because it is variable depending on load. If you're running 20 channels 24/7, your bill is not going to vary 3% per month, you know, on our systems. If you're running something, let's say that's a platform for house of worship, where you'll have, you know, 3,000 spin up for an hour and spin back down, that gets a little hard. And then there's also the whole idea, well, why didn't you turn the encoder off? You're going to pay for it if you leave it on. If you leave 1,000 on, it's going to, you know, so the predictability and variability is really more of the challenge than is it cheaper on cloud or on-prem. At least the C-level management that I have the chance to talk to, predictability, they don't like unpredictable finance models.
But there is a way to be predictive in cloud, though. So there's this, you know, you can model out your cloud costs. That I think that the bigger challenge is actually getting your FinOps folks to actually convert their mindset from CapEx to OpEx, and understanding, like, you know, why I can't write this stuff off every 3 years or every 5 years and try to hide money like 3-card Monte on a New York street corner, you know, to try to figure out how to make budgets play out in different ways. And I think that those days have to end, because the fact that, you know, we are playing these finance games and finance models with physical assets. That physical asset will only do what you need it to do with the time you buy it. Cloud will continue to evolve, and that same device, EC2, whatever it happens to be running, that thing will have a life 3, 5, 6 years from the time that you implement it, because of the evolution of software over the top that makes it more valuable, right? The hardware encoder will, again, only do as much as it's meant to do for the lifespan of that device, right? And then you have to purchase a new one every 3 to 5 years, right? So we have to get out of this mindset that, you know, cloud is so much more expensive, because the hardware model is by far less agile and more less cost effective, in my opinion, than moving to cloud. It
also, by the way, is sometimes less predictable, because when are you going to need to replace that piece of hardware, right? If it's in a cloud model, you have a predictable cost year after year that's going to be about the same. Most cloud providers don't suddenly raise their prices. If anything, they go down a little bit or they stay the same, right? Whereas for the hardware, you don't know if you're going to get budget to replace that in 3 years or 5 years or 6 years. So how long is it going to run for? Nobody knows. And that becomes less predictable, to me at least.
In cloud, if you have a piece of machinery that's acting up, you move it to another, you migrate it to another host. In cloud, you have a matrix card that dies in the box, or a hard drive that goes sideways. That box is dead until you find a replacement. And in fact, if you can't even find a replacement.
Okay. Now, okay. So I'm going to jump to AI again. Daniel, you mentioned managing your network and your quality of service, et cetera, using AI and ML. So, and this is definitely something that you're not going to be able to do with an on-prem system. But Daniel, you know, can you give us a little bit of insight? Because you started to talk about it earlier. How do you do this? Because realistically, that's something that's absolutely new.
So it's a marriage of the protocol itself. You do have to build the protocol a bit ground up. This is not an off-the-shelf. Open source protocols are not built for it. So when you have a protocol that does the routing with a timestamp awareness of the network at the layer 3 level, and is capable of sequencing itself from the encode to the decode side before it gets stripped away. Just with that predictive capability or dynamic predictive capability alone, before you start putting in AI command and control, or initially machine learning command and control, we set a series of algorithms and tell the infrastructure to make the changes in order to do that. But then once you put artificial intelligence in place, it sits there and it leverages the protocol itself to identify the quality of service on the network infrastructure, and then be able to use it to assess it and switch the service in real time in order to avoid a lot of the challenges that you will see. Congestion. I think of the Olympics, right? If you're sitting there, we got it down to the protocol being on mobile phones. Somebody was asking in the Q&A, would I see SRT is also being used as a delivery system as a protocol? And the answer is yes, because the more compute power you have from lens to eyeballs, the more you're capable of actually delivering all the way to the end. And you're going to see more of these aggressive protocols being put all the way at the end. And in doing that, in that design, it's the natural evolution of live IP broadcasting, right? It was, if you look 3 to 5 years ago, people were doing active solutions. This is very primitive for a broadcast service. No, nobody here wants to hear that. Corey, don't laugh.
Well,
But
I haven't heard that term in quite some time, and now it's like business continuity. But
yeah. So what it brings to the table, because most people, when they hear AI, I think about it from a media perspective. Most people, when they hear AI, what they are thinking of is, how is AI working with data analytics? As Nishant brought up, how is it tagging my media content so that it's referenceable later on and quite quickly for pre-production, post-production work, right? Or is it doing my transcoding or my SMPTE 104 for me appropriately, so I have the right kind of ticker tape or underlying infrastructure? Or AI has been put in all those areas, but not in the broadcast side. And so that's a clear differentiator. And I think the market will catch up eventually, but with our system, with the over the top, we're the only ones doing it. And that gave us a clear advantage. And what I would do, again, is put in place the right network infrastructure in order to support it. So it can't just be the AI in place, but giving the AI the right set of network services available to it to make the decisions. What that means is diversity. As Corey mentioned before, that there's some production houses that kind of stay stuck in certain cloud service providers, and mindsets. And what we've seen is them kind of being more comfortable with adaptation. COVID did help. You have more remote on-site production in conjunction with in-cloud production, and it was like, what can go where, and how does that serve for the content's distribution? And we would see a lot more of this diversity occur, especially where maybe it's not tier 1 sports, maybe it's tier 3 sports, maybe it's someone with a budget that they don't necessarily have the capability to actually utilize a cloud production center, or they can only utilize it for a limited amount of time. So they're like, I've got 3 or 4 events on this weekend. I can only spin it up and use it and activate it then. Maybe I'm going to do 50% of this as remote production, and then the other 50% in the cloud, and reduce my cost. And so
Let me let me jump in for 1 second here, because we only have 3 minutes left, and I want to just quickly hit on this. So I mean, Daniel, I thought it was really fascinating when we talked in the planning call. You talked about how you were actually able to use kind of AI and ML to really make sure that you had the right path, I should say, for traffic, and not have, and that was one of the things I was fascinated about. You also just mentioned Scotty. Does anybody want to quickly, like I can give you guys each 30 seconds to talk about how monetization is supported by being in the cloud. Nishant, do you want to kind of hit this?
Yeah, I think I'll bring up a great example of how the Olympics, like the IBC, worked this year. So when you are using cloud, you have a lot more observability in understanding the metrics of all the streams. And when you're working with all the media right holders, you're able to really measure, map, and see per click, and really create new pricing models. And that really helps you be more efficient and just serve better models.
Okay. Next, anyone else here? Unfortunately, you have very little time, but Corey, can you jump in for 30 seconds?
So, I built and deployed the Galaza network last year, or almost 2 years ago now, I guess it was. But it was the first digital linear true running cloud network where we had, we were acquiring live streams to cloud, whether it was soccer matches or whatnot. Packaging and distribution was in cloud. Captions were in cloud with Lexi. We had live record, clipping, playout, asset management, all living in cloud. But it was an ad-supported network. So, in the playlist, we're dropping in Scuddy markers just like you would in a live, on-prem environment. So just because it's in cloud doesn't mean your workflow is different. Philosophy dictates that it should just be like broadcast. If it looks like broadcast, it should feel like broadcast, regardless of the 4 walls you're in. So the monetization opportunities on the IP side may differ a little bit because your screen consumption is a little different than traditional linear, but it's the same mentality as a broadcaster regardless.
Okay.
Yeah, I've been working with some customers in sports, and the being able to pull this all together, the fan engagement, the sponsor engagement, the venue engagement, the parking services, the ticketing, the video, the data coming off the players, the data coming off the field, the data going, into video cameras. That would be very difficult for a tier 3 sport or a tier 2 sport to even begin to think about on-prem or any other way. And the other thing I'll say is there is a real blossoming of edge devices to help support this, devices that are made to help feed the cloud with data measured on the field. And, so there's a lot of this coming together that I really don't think conceivably you could do this any other way but the cloud. And most of these vendors and people I'm working with, they're cloud first companies. Okay. Some of them didn't even exist as an on-prem.
We have run out of time. I could continue, but I have to cut us off because Evan's going to cut us off.
Okay.
Thank you all, guys. We will have more of this conversation in the future. Obviously, it's been very engaging for everyone. And make sure you come and listen to the replay of this if you're interested. Thank you all. Thank you, Evan. I guess I have to turn it back to you now, right? We're out of time.
No, you have no choice. Great conversation and pretty much epitomizing the transformation of our business. I think, in this microcosm writ large. So thank you all panelists for such a great conversation. Nadine, great job as always. Thank you to Alibaba Cloud for sponsoring this. Our winner of the song contest. First of all, the song was Soul Impressions by Janko Nilovic. And the winner is Beth Rosen, who not only answered correctly, but stuck around for the whole panel. Thank you. And as did a huge number of people. So thank you all for sticking around. Our next panel is is in 1/2 hour at 1 o'clock. It's Game Changer, 5G, live sports, and streaming. So come back in just about 30 minutes for a great panel. And once again, all of our content from this week at Streaming Media Connect will be on Streaming Media's YouTube page next week. So look for the link in the chat. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you in about 30 minutes.
Thank you.
Take care.